Hey everyone, and welcome to another YouTube video, this time covering E3 2021. So E3 is a really interesting event. It's something that I, as weird as it sounds, look forward to every year, which I think is funny because it's essentially a giant ad or a series of ads. Companies spending a lot of time investing in trailers, investing in celebrity appearances, trying to create the most exciting showcase for their upcoming games and why you should go to their platform or buy their exclusives or buy their hardware to play their exclusive games. So it's funny to think about it like from a very practical or realist standpoint, which I think is important to keep in mind. But I'm a warm fuzzy gamer at heart, and at the end of the day, like I still get that feeling when watching E3 of like being a kid on the night before Christmas. You know what I mean? It's like, look at all of these cool shiny things that you can look forward to that are potentially really exciting. And so for me, watching E3 is not only nostalgic because I've been watching it for so long, but very much is a rare opportunity I find to capture those feelings of like innocence and excitement around games coming up. Keeping in mind that it's important to be a little bit cynical in the back of your mind, that not all of the trailers will, live up to the hype, but I still enjoy it. And so I watch every year, and I want to sort of record some of my thoughts and talk about what stood out to me this year, both in terms of general trends and some of my major takeaways, both in terms of games that I've added on my watch list, and then also just talking about some of my favorite trailers or favorite games that I'm most looking forward to coming out of the event. And I think this year was really interesting. There was sort of two overarching themes that I think are takeaways for this year in my mind, or experientially how it was for me. One is just how we've seen year over year an increasing trend towards stratification of the number of conferences. I ended up tweeting about this because it just sort of blew me away, but there's like almost 30, if not over 30 conferences at this point across like a 5-day period that is E3, which I don't like. I think it makes more sense because for developers or for publishers, because at that point they're able to showcase just their games and give them the best light possible. But essentially from like the consumer or fan perspective, it's basically impossible to keep up with these. I think one of the advantages of having essentially like what used to be the big three, right? Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo have their own conferences, was that you got a more condensed version of like, cool, here's the biggest beats for E3. And you still have that with the Nintendo, with the Microsoft, and this year with the Summer Game Fest conferences. I think those were sort of the big three this year in terms of major announcements. So you still have that, but it's a shame because I feel like if you really want to experience all of the games, like you're going to have to watch a lot of the conferences, or it's just much harder to keep up with the trailers. And like, as someone who tried to watch all of the conferences historically, this was basically the first year that I felt it was impossible to do so. I ended up watching all of the main conferences that I mentioned earlier, and then tried to watch a bunch of the medium conferences. So I've been enjoying the Devolver Digital conference every year because theirs is so unique. I always watch the PC gaming show as well because one, Day 9 is awesome, and two, I'm a PC gaming elitist. So that's always fun. But yeah, it's just a shame that there's so many conferences because it means that it's almost impossible to keep up. There's a website that I highly recommend called E3 Recap, and I'll link it in the description, that helped me a lot just in terms of trying to figure out like, what trailers exist and trying to make sure that there wasn't any gems in the rough sort of hidden or buried. But then obviously, for all of the AAA investments, you'll get those in the main conferences. So at the very least, I'll have a sense of like culturally what the most significant stuff on the horizon is. So I feel like that was sort of one of the themes of this year, because ever since the major split from companies wanting to do their own thing, which makes sense from like a selfish, company perspective, because they can promote it best directly to their fans, and they don't have to worry about like competing for other, spots with other game developers or publishers. I just think it's so noticeable at the fan experience now of the event that it just sucks. And it's never been to this degree before. So that was one of the major themes. The other major theme that I wanted to touch on for E3 that I noticed this year was the co-streaming stuff. I think because of the DMCA stuff that happened in this past year, You really saw the ramifications of that in terms of what it meant for influencers or content creators being able to cover the event. And you saw everything from, I think, the most negative side of that, which was Nintendo actively tweeting out or mentioning like, hey, you're not allowed to co-stream this event, which is, classic Nintendo being behind on the times and not understanding how modern content creation works for their games. Nothing new there, right? They hate esports, they hate content creators, and they hate streamers. So good job, Nintendo. But then the other thing that you saw was the Twitch gaming channel having versions of these major conference streams without DMCA music, which led to hilarious clips on live stream fails of people watching game trailers with just complete silence and like random sound effects, which was super, super awkward and took away a lot of the hype. Which sucks, because I think, one of my fond memories and nostalgic memories is like watching Total Biscuit's Snarkathon. I tried to tune in and watch streamers watching the event. I tuned into Lyric, I tuned into Pokelaw's to try to like get a sense of like their reactions, because I always think those are very entertaining. And I would even potentially be interested in doing, a co-stream myself. But it's like, as a small channel, I can't even begin to think about risking DMCA. And I get it from the publisher side, because there's so many different games in a single conference. It's so much different music licensing. To be able to extend that licensing to co-streams seems pretty much impossible given the scale of things. So it makes total sense for why that is. But it's interesting because this is the first year I think that we ever really noticed it, because of the DMCA stuff that's been happening on Twitch. Like like I said, I used to watch creators in past years react to the announcements live and give their takes, and I've always really enjoyed that. But it felt like this year that content creators' ability to do that was really impacted for the first time, which, a lot of people I think got around it by either watching the Twitch Gaming official channel or just deleting the VODs, which feels like a janky way to solve it. So I hope, that works out for them. But it's a shame, and I feel like that was the other major theme for E3 this year was the co-streaming stuff. As someone who cares a lot and pays attention a lot to the content creator side of things. But anyway, without further ado, I want to get into my main categories. So there's a couple of categories. I'll just go through the categories now to give you a heads up. But essentially covering like the most noticeable things for E3 in terms of takeaways on my end. One will be my favorite trailer. One will be my most anticipated game coming out of the event. And then also my most anticipated indie game as well, because I feel like those are sufficiently different categories. And then even also the most anticipated DLC. There's so many live service games nowadays that I think it's important to split out that category as well. Even though it's funny seeing live service games as part of these conferences, because I think most people's reaction to those type of updates or announcements will be like, well, I don't even play that game, because you can only play so many live service games. But anyway, the other categories that I wanted to cover was most pleasant surprise. So this would be a game that I had potentially low expectations for, but I ended up walking away being like, yeah, I want to keep an eye on that game, see if it ends up panning out. And then the last one is, I think, the most fun question of E3, or historically has been like the centerpiece, like I think kind of low-key troll question, which is who won. And since PlayStation and Sony isn't here for this event, it just feels like we're missing something. But I'll still cover which conference I enjoyed the most at the end and talk about why that is. And then I'll conclude the video with a list of games that I added to my watch list. I essentially have a list that I keep track of the games that I want to play, or games that I want to pay attention to when they launch, to see the reviews, to see if it's good. And I ended up adding more games on my watch list this year than I expected. So I think I ended up with about 12 games total, which was quite a few. Some of which have been announced before, but I didn't really get any interest until the trailers or the gameplay from this event, and some of which I think were announced or really given light at this event for the first time. So anyway, without further ado, let's hop into my first category, which was my favorite trailer of the event. All right, so my favorite trailer of the event was actually a trailer that came out before the event even started, which was Battlefield 2042. This is interesting because I would not consider myself a fan of Battlefield. I ended up playing the games growing up a little bit and have fond memories of throwing C4 on a car and then driving that car into a base and then, blasting the explosives. I think, moments like those are what Battlefield is known for, and I have fond memories of those growing up. And then more recently, I played Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4 and enjoyed those quite a bit, and played some of the newer ones as well, but 5 and the World War One game didn't do as much for me. Ended up turning out pretty quickly from those. So it's sort of weird that I am now excited about the new Battlefield game. But I think the reason for that is just how well they managed to capture the gameplay of what Battlefield is. And more generally, I think the fact that the trailer is self-aware that what they're promoting is a game, which I feel like at E3 especially, when so much polish and care is given to these trailers, there's a lot of, I don't know, over dramatization or feeling of like trying to make it look like a movie. Cinematic trailers, I think, are particularly guilty of this, and one of my biggest complaints around E3 year to year is the lack of gameplay shown in a lot of these trailers, because in my opinion, if they don't show any gameplay, the trailer is kind of worthless. Like, sure, it can be pretty to look at and stuff, but it doesn't actually tell the consumer whether they'll like the game at all. And so if a game doesn't actually have any gameplay, it's essentially meaningless to me personally. But the Battlefield trailer didn't have this problem at all. It showed a decent amount of gameplay, and it particularly was self-aware of the fact that it was a game. It used a cinematic lens to be able to highlight fun gameplay mechanics, which is something I don't think you really see often, and something that I deeply, deeply appreciated from the trailer. Like, it made it look like playing the game, not just experiencing the game, was actively fun. And it showed that both through the gameplay and through the cinematics. And so I give the trailer a lot of credit. Like, obviously the highlight scene, if you haven't seen it, or if you have, is the, jumping out of a jet and, throwing a rocket launcher at another jet and then hopping back in, right? Like, those moments are what define Battlefield, or the fun of Battlefield as a unique game in the industry and within the genre. And the fact that they really embraced that, and that the trailer felt like a love letter to the community, which you really don't see that, I think, especially with sequels, but just in general with games. There was really only one trailer during the event that was also equally self-aware, and that was the Outer Wilds 2, or Outer Worlds 2 rather, similar names. But I think with that trailer, on the flip side, it ended up being like almost too on the nose, where it didn't actually say anything at all about the game. So it was entertaining, but completely meaningless in terms of actually showing the audience what the game was. But Battlefield nailed it. They were able to both be self-aware about the fact that it was a game and sort of poke fun at traditional games for that reason, and then also sell the experience of like, hey, this is why you play Battlefield. I ended up watching the trailer over the course of the weekend like 2 or 3 times, and every single time I was just sort of like smile across the face, like, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to a return to a modern setting, because I think that's just a little bit more compelling to me in terms of like embracing the Battlefield chaos. I think it's harder to have that level of fast-paced chaos in an older setting. And I'm just really looking forward to it. I don't know if I'll play it for very long, because I tend to, have more casual fun with Battlefield games. But like, the fact that they're embracing the chaos in such a earnest way is something that I can't help but respect. So on the topic of surprising games, my biggest surprise that I had low expectations for coming into the event, but ended up walking away from the event more excited than I initially anticipated, was a game that Ubisoft presented called Riders Republic. And this game is interesting because it was already announced before, and I'm pretty sure announced previously at a different E3 where they showcased some of the game, and I wasn't really interested. There's another game that the studio released a while back called Steep, which I did enjoy, and that had a lot of similar core gameplay. So for example, snowboarding or the gliding, it was very much a snow-focused game, and this one has greater variety in terms of like mountain biking and more desert climates as well. But the core gameplay of that was pretty fun, and the reason why that type of gameplay interests me is it reminds me of a lot of like SSX Tricky, or even Tony Hawk Pro Skater, those old like arcadey style sports games. I think a lot of modern sports game, especially like if you look to like football or soccer or even Forza, a lot of those games tend to focus on realism and a level of very like serious gameplay. And as someone who just doesn't care that much about like the core sports experience for traditional sports, I tend to like zone out pretty quickly. But I really miss like SSX Tricky and Tony Hawk for their arcade style of gameplay, and I feel like this could potentially capture that. I was a little bit hesitant to embrace the game last time I saw it because it didn't look like it necessarily added enough that would be compelling, But I think what really stood out to me this time around was the downhill races with the large number of players, and particularly how they highlighted the fact that you can basically be a bit of a troll and have unconventional riding devices. You'll see in the trailer if you watch it, or if you've already seen it before, but it really seems like the game actually wants you to have fun. And I think that was it sounds, obviously all games want you to have fun, but the fact that they're doing that through more of an arcadey style as opposed to like a realism or immersion style, I think is exactly like what I look for in those type of games. And like I said, I enjoyed Steep, so I think after seeing the gameplay this time around, it's actually on my list of games to watch. I'm going to keep an eye on it, see how the reviews do. But the idea of shooting at 60 miles per hour down a hill, barely being able to control a bike or a snowboard, just seems really fun. And being able to not only just keep a handle on the situation, but do crazy jumps where I do backflips until I smash my face into the ground. Like, that seems really fun, and especially if you throw in the chaos of extra players, I feel like that could be a really compelling core experience. So I'm going to keep my eye on the game. Who knows? Could be good. Switching it up from the previous categories, next up are the most anticipated categories. So these are essentially coming out of the event, the games or DLCs or whatever that I'm most looking forward to as a result of the trailers and what we saw at the event. Sort of these are the games that I most have my eye on. And kicking it off with the most anticipated DLC. So I think DLC is a really interesting topic or mini trend to see within the context of E3, because obviously over time, as more games turn to live services, focus on adding DLC, focus it on content updates, you're going to see more and more of these type of announcements. It honestly felt like half of the content at E3 this year was actually for content updates for live service games, which I think is fine, but I always think they're really funny because you can only play so many live service games, and so the fact that so many of the announcements are focused on content updates, I think a lot of people's eyes will just sort of glaze over. They're like, well, I don't even play that game. This update, this trailer isn't even relevant for me. And obviously, developers are wanting people to, if they haven't tried the game, give it a shot for the first time, or if they've played it previously, try it again with the new content update. But anyway, it's a cool mini trend, I think, to pay attention to and see how that develops. But in terms of the actual DLC announcement or trailer that got me most excited, as you can see, it is the Streets of Tarkov DLC for Escape from Tarkov. And Tarkov, I think, is just a really special game. I think its vision and uncompromising sort of gameplay feel around being essentially, and I don't know if this is the right term for it, but like a milsim, very tactile, very laborious in terms of actually, the minutia of the different bullets and different guns, ammo, and a lot of the actions being very manual. It's about as far away from an arcade experience as you can get. I really like that core experience. It feels like an evolution on what made DayZ really popular. Instead of going the battle royale route, going on the realism route, except trying to really polish that up and make it a compelling core experience. And when Tarkov first came out, I ended up playing quite a decent amount of it at launch. I had a lot of fun with the realism aspect. It reminded me a lot of the reasons why I liked DayZ, except a bit more polished. But I ended up stopped playing it because it was very, very stressful, and I got tons and tons of anxiety of losing the gear and the high lethality. But I think that's what makes the game fun, and I think that's what makes the game special. And the Streets of Tarkov DLC really looks interesting. The very urban thematic feels pretty different from a lot of the forest environments or single building skirmishes that happens in the existing game. And again, hitting on the nostalgia for DayZ, I think it captures a lot of those old cities in DayZ that I used to wander around. And I think the cool corridor gameplay that can result from a more urban environment, I think is going to be really fun. So who knows, I might actually return to the game just to check out the new map, but we'll see. And in slowly escalating the grandeur of the most anticipated categories, let's hop on to the most anticipated indie game for me, which was Death's Door. So obviously, visually, this game stands out a lot. It's made by a company that made a game called Titan Souls, which I played, which had very simplistic combat, but was a boss rush style game. So it was particularly compelling from the boss design perspective and the mechanics of the boss fights. And so I ended up enjoying that game. It wasn't amazing. It didn't blow me away. I thought Fury, for example, which was another boss rush game released around the time, did a better job of exploring the mechanical variety of like what you can do with a boss rush style game, but I still thought Titan Souls had legs, and I ended up, enjoying the experience. So when Death's Door got announced, I was like, okay, cool, like this has a chance to be pretty interesting. In terms of comparing it to Titan Souls, their previous game, you can see there's a lot more focus on just general combat, and it's not necessarily just pure boss rush. So I'm curious to like see how that ends up panning out. But I mean, just with the visuals alone, and knowing their pedigree in terms of their ability to design interesting boss fights, and just looking at the trailer, it feels like, there's definitely going to be a meaty experience here. I think the question is, how good does it feel to play when it comes out? So I'm not like super bullish about like, hey, this is going to be a crazy indie game that I have to play. There weren't really any indie games coming out of the event that I was like, yep, this was made specifically for me. But I think this had a cool enough visual aesthetic and like core combat that it's like, okay, cool, like let's pay attention to this, see where it goes, because I think it definitely has all the ingredients in the recipe to be a compelling experience. But it's definitely a wait and see, and see how it does on release. Which brings us to the penultimate category, the most anticipated game for me coming out of the event. And this isn't going to be a surprise to anyone, so there's no point in beating around the bush. It's Elden Ring. I think a lot of PC gamers are this is essentially, I think, going to be like the new Cyberpunk. I think it's the best way to put it, right? I think a lot of PC gamers are really looking forward to the game. I think it's got a not Cyberpunk levels of hype, but like a decent amount of hype behind it. I think the most controversial, or like thing that I'm most concerned about, is the fact that it's going to be more of an open world experience. As From Software hasn't really necessarily done a pure open world experience, although they've certainly experimented with the idea. I think especially with Sekiro, in having more of like, backtracking or open world aspects to the game. I'm hoping that they don't fall into the same tropes or traps that a lot of AAA Western developers run into when they're developing open world games around introducing a lot of filler content. I'm not super worried about that for FromSoft, because I feel like A, the core combat is so compelling, but B, I feel like they have a pretty good handle on like what they want to do and how to execute on their vision. It feels like they're a developer that really sort of has a clear idea of like how they envision their game to be. And I think, like, looking at the trailer, there's a lot of reason to be excited about it, right? I think for a lot of fans, aesthetically or mechanically, it looks more of like a return to the Dark Souls games as opposed to Sekiro, which felt like a little bit of a departure. So I think there's a lot of reason to be excited about it. Obviously, having George R.R. Martin on the world design team is also going to be really interesting, given his history in film and the cool creepy world design that he could potentially be able to add there. So it has a lot of aspects of it that could be really, really compelling. And I think a lot of people just are really hungry for a new, FromSoft game. Like, FromSoft games feel really unique. Obviously, they spawned a whole subgenre of like Souls-like games because they've had so much success. But I don't think a lot of games are able to capture the core experience that FromSoft is able to deliver on. And so I think for like I said, most PC gamers, this is probably going to be their one to watch. This is going to be the game that defines, the calendar year for when it releases. So fingers crossed that it's good. Out of all of the games that I've mentioned so far, or will mention, like, this is going to be the one that like it's going to be hard for me not to buy it, but I'm still going to wait for reviews, still going to see how it goes, and then probably still play it anyway, because God, FromSoft is such a good studio. And last but not least is our very final category, who won E3? It is the Twitter debate question that I love to revisit every year, which you don't really see it as much, in my opinion, in recent years, because there isn't that much like direct one-to-one comparison of like the Sony, Nintendo, Xbox conferences. It's, like I said, it's more stratified conferences, so it's harder to make like the argument of who won. But I think it's a fun question. I like the sort of like pseudo competition that stirs, and particularly some of the fanboyism that comes out, because I just think it's funny to like laugh at the fanboyism of like, no, I'm an Xbox diehard. Like, I think all that stuff is ridiculous, right? You just want to be able to play the best games. But I think the narrative of like trying to play into it, I think is pretty funny, even if it's just from like a coy attitude or perspective. But anyway, the conference that I enjoyed the most, and I thought did the best job this year, was actually Summer Game Fest, which is not even any of the major developers or publishers. And to be honest, I think that's part of the reason why it was so successful. I think a lot of people are going to look at that answer and be like, well, they announced Elden Ring, so obviously. But what I particularly enjoyed about their conference relative to others was just the pure gameplay that they showed and the pure quality of titles. They had indie games mixed in there that looked really interesting, some of which will show up on my list later. And they also were able to announce some like pretty cool stuff around AAA games as well, or games that clearly had more of a budget being able to put into them. Obviously, Jeff Keighley was able to leverage his relationships with Kojima to, get some fun Kojima shenanigans as well. And in classic Jeff Keighley fashion, ended up, adding in some more mainstream elements as well, whether that was actors coming on or even being able to promote the video game movie that they promoted during it, which feels very hokey, I think, and particularly that movie is like a little bit cringe with how it's using content creators, but that's not his fault. But I think that stuff was integrated pretty well. I think one of my criticisms of the Game Awards that Jeff has run in previous years was that they felt like too sellouty, or like the mainstream didn't click as much with like the nerd or gamer culture. And I felt like this was a much more integrated experience. It felt very natural, the trailers and things that were shown throughout the pace of the conference, and I didn't really feel like there was a lot of stalling. It felt like it had good pacing to it. It felt like there wasn't a lot of filler, and so I give Jeff a lot of credit. Like I think his show killed it. If there was a runner-up award, I would give it to the Microsoft conference for a lot of the same reasons, showing a lot of gameplay. But I think the problem with a lot of dedicated publisher or developer conferences is that they have to hype up their major titles that are coming, even if they don't actually have anything to show for it. So like, for example, in the Xbox conference, the fact that they showed Starfield, a cinematic trailer, was like, okay, they have to do that because Bethesda's making, a new IP, and it's like, ooh, that's going to have a lot of hype behind it. But like there was no gameplay. It was just a pointless space cinematic trailer, which I maybe I'm too cynical for like not being able to enjoy that for what it is. But like I literally saw comments after that being like, oh my God, I can't wait for Starfield. I'm going to buy the game. And it's like, you literally don't even know the gameplay. Like you just know nothing about it. Like you can't make that assessment. And that always is really tilting to me. And I feel like particularly like E3 has had a bad history in previous years of just showing cinematic trailer, or like very scripted gameplay. And so I just think that's like not the way to do it. Like it feels like it's lying. It feels like a waste of time for people who actually enjoy playing games. It really does feel like very much a product showcase, not a like actual game showcase. And it's essentially the same thing, but I feel like the feel is very different. And it's funny because like this stuff matters, right? You saw it with like Watch Dogs in years past about like the pre-rendered experience versus the actual gameplay experience and the visual fidelity downgrades. You see it, obviously like No Man's Sky is another legendary example, or even Cyberpunk, how that got overhyped. And even this year, there was the whole Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't know if fiascos are probably a strong word, but I would call it a bit of a disaster, which is that they spent like 30 minutes of one of the conferences talking about the game, the first 10 minutes being like a pre-cut trailer that actually made it look pretty good, and I actually added it to my games watch list of games to keep an eye on. And then they continued on for like another 10 minutes with developer interviews and showing the same clips again, and then they ended it with like a 10-minute walkthrough of like one of the missions that was literally live gameplay, and it all fell apart. I actually took it off my watch list because it was so bad. Like the funny quips, the funny dialogue, the funny the entertaining sort of writing fell apart completely in terms of the pacing of being able to integrate it through walking around the world. The voice acting for some of the characters felt really off, particularly for Drax. It did not feel like a match at all. Felt very like budget, and the worst, in the most egregious aspect, was that when it actually got to the combat, it literally lagged in the trailer. Like you could, it's 2 FPS Twitch chat memes because it was had such poor fidelity. And it was just like kind of embarrassing. Like it made it go from being like, cool, this is, is this going to be like a Spider-Man game, to nope, this is going to be like your traditional movie license game that feels like, a bin, like a discount bin style GameStop, game that you like throw in the discount box and pick it up for like a kid for the holidays or something, right, at like half price. Like it feels like it's going to be one of those experiences in my mind. Which is generally what I think historically how licensed games, particularly movie licensed games, turn out. Like that's not uncommon. The fact that Spider-Man was such a success is in contrast to I think how most licensed game works. And I think you see it a lot, even more recently with like the Avengers game, right? The fact that like it was basically a button mashing loot grind with no end game, right? Like you see these problems all the time, and I think this game is going to end up teetering on that side of it. So feels bad to punch that game while it's I think down, but I think as an example is like a cautionary tale of like why gameplay matters so much, and which just brings me back to like the original point of this category, which is like why I appreciated the Summer Game Fest presentation at the end of the day above everything else for this year's E3. Alrighty, to close out the video, I wanted to talk about the games that I added to my watch list from this year's E3. So my watch list is basically just a wish list. It's a sticky note of games that I'm interested in. I like to keep a log of games that sort of catch my attention so that I can make sure that when they release, I get to check out the reviews, see if it's something worth playing. Can never have enough games on my list to play, But yeah, E3 is obviously a really good event for that because you get exposed to a lot of games, a lot of trailers, you get to see how the gameplay is developing, or new games that you should keep an eye on. There was a lot of games on my watch list already that were covered in the event because they had been announced previously, such as Starfield, Psychonauts 2, Halo Infinite, Elden Ring, 12 Minutes, and Breath of the Wild 2. And then obviously some of the games I covered in this video I seemed like is something I would enjoy or am interested in. So those include Death's Door, the new Battlefield, and Riders Republic. But there's some games that I haven't touched on yet that I wanted to cover. And overall, I think this E3 was pretty good because I ended up adding somewhere around 12 games to my watch list, which is a pretty high number for previous years. So, I mean, if the purpose was to get a list of games that I'm interested in and keep an eye on, like overall mission accomplished. But yeah, to close out the video, let me just go through the games, talk a little bit about why I'm interested in them, and who knows, maybe they'll catch your eye as well. Alrighty, so the first game up is a game that was announced, I believe, at a previous E3 during the Devolver Digital panel, and that's Phantom Abyss. This is one of the more visible games in terms of like already seeing the gameplay, because there was also a streamer event where streamers got to try out the game. It's coming out on Steam pretty soon in early access, and they've shown a lot of gameplay. Obviously from obviously the gameplay is the most interesting because it sort of has that Fall Guys-esque like obstacle course style. That seems like it should, it could be fun. Yeah, obviously I don't think it's gonna be as nearly as successful as Fall Guys, but I think obstacle course style games are pretty fun. And then the main gimmick being that like, hey, only one person can complete the tempo once. And I also think the asynchronous multiplayer is a pretty cool aspect of the game. So who knows? Probably like not the most deep game in terms of how many hours you can get out of it, but it seems like it has a core mechanics that should be enough to at least be worth a couple hours of fun. And next up is a game called Lost Ark, which is also a game that there's a lot of existing gameplay out there for because it already is released in Korea as well as Russia. So there's even some Steam reviews on it for the game. So the release that's actually coming out is the English version. I have not seen a lot of this game, but the pitch seems to be that it's an MMO with an action RPG, like Diablo-esque style combat system, which I love MMOs. I play a lot of them. I like trying out new MMOs, even if I don't necessarily, make it to the end game of every single one because of how much hours it requires. But I mean, it looks interesting enough, and I think the thing that really stood out for me and why it made it on my watch list for this year was the hint of scale in the trailer, from just like the fact that like there's these massive battles going on, and I really don't know how that'll work out for the style of combat or the fact that it's an MMO. I don't know if I played an MMO with an action RPG style combat system like this. So could be interesting. Like, it has enough there that I'm like, okay, cool. Like, I definitely want to check this out, and we'll see if it sticks or not. But I mean, even the existing reviews for like the Russian version on Steam are pretty positive. So seems like there's a lot of positive flags indicating like, hey, this could be a worthwhile experience. And conversely, for a game that we know almost nothing about, and was just announced this year is called Solar Ash. I got a lot of like Journey or Abzu style vibes from this, obviously with a combat layer on top of it. The visuals, of course, look like super interesting, and then the combat definitely calls back to like Shadow of the Colossus style. The combat looks a little bit janky, so I'm not like, super sold, and we also didn't get a lot of gameplay in the trailer. It was very much like a hint. But that hint was like, okay, cool. Like if this is the slice of game, like this could actually be potentially interesting. I find that over time I enjoy those like 3 to 5 hour, like really well crafted experiences much more than like a 60 to 100 hour epic campaign. So, this could be something that's right up my alley, and I definitely want to keep an eye on it once it gets closer to release. And perhaps the weirdest game on this list is Ratchet and Clank, which is already out. But it was not on my list before. So obviously we've seen a lot of it in previous expos or previous trailers. And I mean, it looks really good. It's by Insomniac, which has a really good track history. The visuals obviously are pretty stunning. Ratchet and Clank, as this series has a lot of history. Wouldn't consider myself a Ratchet and Clank fan, but like it looks like it has, not necessarily because I've played the other games and didn't like them. I just haven't played a lot of them. I didn't grow up on them. But I mean, the core combat looks fine enough, like looks pretty goofy, and I think the visuals are just impressive enough. But it's on my watch list instead of my playlist because I don't own a PlayStation 5 like I imagine quite a few people out there. So I think it's probably going to be one of those games that for people who do end up getting a PS5 eventually, will probably it'll be one of the go-to just platform must play because of the quality. I mean, also just because I don't think there's a lot of games on PlayStation 5 that are console exclusive that are necessarily worth playing. I tweeted when the new Xbox and Sony consoles first came out, but I just don't think their launch platforms are particularly exciting. So I think a lot of it is for those. I think a lot of the developments for those companies are going to be trying to actually fill their platform. Obviously Xbox is writing on Halo Infinite to beef up their side as well. So yeah, I mean, it looks like Ratchet and Clank is a pretty good game. It's hard to make any hard criticisms of what we've seen. So I think it's just something that whenever I do get a PlayStation 5, I'm gonna play through. And next up in the theme of relatively big AAA releases is Far Cry 6. In previous years, in previous trailers, we've seen a lot of hype around the villain, a lot of pre-rendered cutscenes. But I think this was the year that we first got to see the gameplay, and that actually hurt my perception of the game quite a bit. The gameplay looked a little bit rough. The gameplay visuals looked a little bit rough. I think Far Cry as a series, as someone who's played a lot of, I think 3 through 5, most of the modern Far Cries, it's a series that feels really, really repetitive, and I think really could use a break. It feels like they're trying to give it a breath of fresh air by going, through such a iconic, actor as the villain as opposed to an original character. I mean, I guess technically it's playing an original character, but whatever. But yeah, I'm after actually seeing the gameplay, I was tempted to take this off the list. It's still on my list of games to watch because the villain could be that cool, and it's not like the fundamentals of Far Cry are broken, but I really wonder if Far Cry could do with a couple years off like Assassin's Creed did to sort of breathe new life into the series, because looking at that gameplay and looking at the in-game visuals really made me feel like they are just pumping out the games too quickly, and it needs more time to sort of differentiate itself from its predecessors. Because Far Cry is fun, which is why it's on my list, but particularly with Far Cry 5, it was not what I would consider a good game. It was just so much filler, so much emptiness. It just didn't feel like it was, I don't know if finished is the right term, but it just did not feel like a fully complete, compelling experience. So out of everything on my list, this is actually the thing I'm probably most hesitant about, but it's on the list just because, maybe it's good. Maybe, the trailers and the gameplay didn't do it justice, and maybe there is some innovation there, but yeah, we'll see. And another game that has AAA vibes, but I actually don't think it would necessarily be considered AAA, is the new Mario Rabbids game. I am not a fan of turn-based games. I generally don't enjoy them, but I played the first Mario Rabbids just because I'm pretty sure I played it on like a plane or something just to like try it out, and I ended up getting more hooked than I thought. The visuals carry it a lot, like particularly with the new game. They're driving on the nostalgia of the Mario Galaxy games quite a bit, but it's just smooth. Like it has that Nintendo polish that just adds so much charm to the game. It's not like the gameplay is bad. Like I actually think they do a decent amount to try to make it feel like it's not turn-based and try to like add more like movement or freedom within the context of like a tactics game. And that works perfect for me because as someone who like doesn't like turn-based games, doesn't like tactics games, like I get pretty bored. Like I want a game to feel kind of meaty. But I think the visual charm of this series, combined with the fact that like it's trying to make its tactics gameplay like, I don't know about less strategic, but just like add more mechanical feedback to it, I think is pretty cool. So who knows? I don't know if I would play this because again, like I enjoyed the first one, but it's just not really my genre. But I think for anyone who enjoys tactics games, especially if they enjoy like Nintendo IP, like this is literally a dream game for them. So I was a really high quality experience certainly for the first one. So definitely keeping my eye on the reviews, and I think there is a chance that I end up picking it up on release. If not, to just power through it for my next plane ride. And in a completely tonally different direction, we have Stalker 2, which the Stalker series is not one that I've played. I've not played the first, but it reminds me a lot of Metro, which is, I think, a pretty interesting game. I think the Metro series is the single-player version of like Tarkov or DayZ, like that heavy realism, sort of like uncompromising vision of reinforcing the immersion through the gameplay mechanics and through the this like slowness or like methodicalness you have to be in just doing basic actions that are usually streamlined in other action games. So I think that's really cool. I don't get the sense that Stalker is like quite that intense, but it definitely gives me those vibes. I mean, obviously the aesthetic is pretty similar to Metro in the fact that it's like, set in Russia, people speaking Russian, as well as the fact that like it's got this like mystical layer, this paranormal layer on top of it. So I'm interested in keeping an eye on it. I prefer single player games, and I enjoy, like, I've played through the original Metros. Didn't try the open world one because I heard that wasn't as good, and I tend to get burnt out on open world games. But yeah, if there's like a super tight single player experience here, then like I'm potentially all about that. Like I could see that being pretty fun, considering I enjoyed the Metro series. And the second to last game on my list is what everyone is essentially calling Left 4 Dead 3, but it's actually called Back 4 Blood. It was interesting because there was a lot of Horde-style games shown at E3, and most of them looked pretty garbage. But Back 4 Blood just really hits differently. Like the gore, I guess, or the brutality of the fact of like slaying these hundreds of zombies, I think like creates a really intense game feel that a lot of other games that were shown in this style did not hit. I think due to the fact that it has a lot of the developers who are on the original Left 4 Dead team is like a huge selling point. It feels like they're doing a lot to just create super, super fun and like meaty gameplay, which I think is like what the series is known for. Like obviously it's not, series known for the story. So it's all about just like giving really good kinetic feedback to the player, and immersing them in this like crazy nonstop sense of like zombies incoming. I think they're going a little bit bigger than the previous Left 4 Dead games through the monster design. They keep teasing at the end of their trailers of like this mega monster, this mega zombie. So I'm curious to see like what that ends up being. But I mean, I think people have wanted Left 4 Dead 3 for a long time, and then unfortunately Valve doesn't know what the number 3 is, so that was never going to happen. But I mean, this feels like basically the best version of that we're ever going to get, considering a lot of, I think, other Horde or like, Horde zombie style games haven't necessarily lived up to that. And I think this is going to be one of those games that like has a high chance to succeed, given what we've seen so far and given the history of the unofficial history of the series, I guess, or the indirect history of the series. So I have a feeling this is going to be one of those games that like people just end up buying in mass as like a go-to potentially for something that they can play with friends. And the very last game on this list is, I'm willing to bet, the one that you probably haven't heard of if you had heard of all of the other games on my watch list, and that is a game called Replaced. I mean, I think the trailer speaks for itself here, right? Like, the visuals are what makes this game interesting. They're just beautiful. Didn't get to see a lot about the combat, but it looks like the animations for the combat are at least interesting. We just don't know enough about this game to like really, make any meaningful conclusions other than like, damn, that pixel art be gorgeous. And as a fan of really compelling indie games with like really unique experiences, whether they're visual, gameplay, or whatever, right? Like, this hits that bar. So I am definitely keeping an eye on this game, and I'm looking forward to learning more because, ooh, baby, that is some pretty graphics. That's so superficial, right? But hey, you know what? I'm down. And that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully some of the games that were on my watch list or that I brought up piqued your interest as well. I think there's a lot to look forward to coming out of this E3. I know a lot of people I saw online were pretty disappointed, but honestly, I was pretty pleased with it. Yeah, we didn't get a lot of new announcements, but I was pretty happy that we were able to see more from some of the games that I was most interested in. And I actually think we got some pretty cool new announcements, both on the indie side and on the AAA front. So yeah, let me know what you thought about the conferences if you got a chance to check them out. Let me know which game stood out to you the most coming out of this year's E3. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.